Yes, we have received your presentation and we will try for you to share the screen indeed if that works best. And if there's any issues, we will be able to share it from our side. But we have received that. So thank you so much for sharing with us.
Can you try to share this? Ask him.
Julian, may I just ask you to try to share the screen just to test if it works quickly?
Sure. We'll do that now.
If possible.
We need to have right there.
Can you see it fine on your side?
Yes, we can see it. That's amazing. Thank you so much. Okay, everyone, if I can ask you to get seated, let's please get started on the session. Thank you so much for joining us today again, and it's my pleasure to be moderating this session. My name is Natalia Mrówczyńska, and I'm the Global Coordinator of the Children and Youth Major Group to UNEP. So those of you who joined the opening session earlier today would have already met me. I have been very excited for this session in particular to reflect on some of the key issues and barriers in the current economic and financial systems and how they impact our ability to deliver on our climate and environmental goals, as well as on environmental and social justice. I think it's fair to say that today's financial economic systems are one of the main, if not the main, obstacles to achieving meaningful environmental and climate progress. Our current economic model rewards extraction and short-term profit, but fails to value equity or planetary health. Frameworks like GDP fail to account for externalities, meaning that socially or environmentally harmful activities are actually seen as value add in a society. And the money really isn't flowing where it should be. We're facing massive shortfalls in the funding needed for real solutions. The SDG financing gap is now estimated at 2.5 to 4 trillion per year. By 2035, developing countries will need approximately 3.2 trillion for climate action alone. This includes approximately 1.3 trillion from international climate finance. And this compares to approximately 200 billion that is being provided today. So there is really a massive gap and we need to ramp up. Meanwhile, just last year, the 65 largest global banks increased their fossil fuel financing by 160 billion, reaching 870 billion total, reversing 2 years of decline. And public subsidies for fossil fuels stand at 1 to 1.5 trillion annually. And the broader financial architecture as well is not set up to facilitate investments where they are most needed, including in environmental action in the global south. Debt burdens, high cost of capital, outdated frameworks, for example, for credit ratings, lack of fiscal space are all severely limiting the ability of countries to invest in climate and environmental priorities. So clearly, the problems are systemic and urgent, which is why I'm so excited to dive into some of the solutions during this session today. And with that, let me briefly introduce the agenda for today's sessions, as well as our wonderful panelists. I'm very pleased to welcome Adriana Zacharias, the Global Coordinator for Finance and Economic Transformations at UNEP. Thank you for joining us, Adriana. We also have Julian Vercruyz, Program Officer from the Beyond Lab, as well as Christine Fiesen, Carlo Schmidt Fellow at the Beyond Lab, joining us online. Hello to you both. Can you hear us well?
Yes, very well. Thank you very much. Good afternoon and nice to be here.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. And we also have Given Huang, our current head of outreach at CYMG and a former global coordinator who will join the panel segment. So the way we will go about this session is we will start with keynote remarks from Adriana. We will then proceed to a presentation by Julian and Christine from the Beyond Lab, and then we will move into a quick panel discussion. I would like to reserve quite a bit of time at the end of this session for the Q&A to give the audience the opportunity to intervene and ask their questions. So we will be working hard to be concise here and make sure that we have time for that as well. And with that, let me hand over to Adriana for her keynote remarks and presentation. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Natalia. I'm very happy to be here today in the Youth Environment Assembly 2025. And I have heard that we have a lot of youth delegates this year, so I'm really happy to see all of you here. I want to tell you a secret. A few years ago, not to say decades ago, I was also sitting on the other side. So I started also as a youth advocate for environment and sustainable development. So just to say, I recognize how important it is really to hear the voice, the power, and the innovation of young people. So with this, just to say, I'm very delighted to be here. Natalia, Guben, we have had a very long journey of cooperation in the last years with Stockholm Plus 50, the Summit of the Future, where we have started to discuss the importance of the finance and the importance of restructuring our financial global system. So with this, let me then start. I've been asked to think and to share with you all these ideas and this thinking and ongoing work on why are we globally thinking on or working on the need to redesign the global financial architecture. Natalia has already highlighted some numbers. But before we start, next slide, please, I would like to ask some questions to you, just to think together why this is so important. So first question, and feel free to raise and open your mic. Do you know how much money we have? What is the global in-debt in terms of US dollar? Any idea? And people online, you can also put some questions in the chat. You can guess it's 100 million, trillions. Oh my God, but you put on the answers. Oh, yeah. Sorry, now I spoiled. Okay, whoever read, you can answer some of the questions. Okay, global in-debt. I see you are very shy, so we need to warm up here. What does it mean? We have globally 251 trillion of US dollar. That is the amount of the debt that most of the countries in the world have. What does it mean? What does it mean when we say in debt? That means that many countries are basically using their public budget to pay interest rate of the debt they have. That means, that's what we say, they have limited fiscal space. That means that countries need to reduce their investment in education, in health, social protection, infrastructure. So that's the main problem when we look at the global in-debt. Second, what is the contrary? Do you know how much is the sovereign wealth globally? And since nobody answers, I will then just click there. So it goes around 13 to 14 trillion, 5% of the debt. Now, for you, what does it mean? It means that here is very important. There are only around 7 countries in the world that basically don't have any foreign debt, that they are basically a creditor, right? They have all these millions. But the problem is, as Natalia was saying, sometimes that money doesn't go where it is needed. These countries doesn't mean that they are going to invest in development. Sometimes they invest in things where they have fast investment of return. Second, a third question, and here I really want to hear voices. Do you know how many people globally live in poverty or extreme poverty? And please consider global population is now 8.2 billion. So how many out of them live in poverty or extreme poverty? And I really expect some answers from the floor.
2 billion or 2 million.
Okay, good guess. Keep it 2 billion. Okay. Extreme poverty. Any idea? I see you Googling. You can also go use ChatGPT. Okay, click. So yes, you are almost right. 2.8 billion live in poverty. And 800 million people are in extreme poverty. What does it mean? People that live with only $3 per day. And then the last question, as Natalia was saying, we need to have also, we are aiming of achieving the SDGs. We have 5 years left. And for that, we still have a huge financial gap. We need approximately, you can click, 5 to 6 trillion to meet the SDGs, including climate, by 2030. So all this, what I wanted just to, next slide, what I really wanted to tell you with these graphs is for you to see what is the financial problems that we have? What is the huge, besides economic finance, how we are also facing social inequalities and the financial gap to meet the SDGs. So why is this important? The discussion today is because we want to see and address the global challenges, because we are very concerned on how we will address climate change, biodiversity loss, and social inequalities. And I'm going to present now some of the work that UNEP is doing in this regard. We were participating in the conference, in the fourth conference of Finance for Development, and we have brought there 5 asks that we believe are very important in helping redesigning our global financial system and addressing these challenges. Next slide, please. So these are the 5 asks. You can go to the first ask. We need to rethink the private sector role. What does it mean? Private sector, private finance is essential to drive sustainability, and we need to reorient them and look at the potential in investment in sustainable development. And here what we need to, and what we're trying to advise then private finance is how can they enhance more strategic blended finance in high impact sectors that often, they are not being seen, or they are still suffering from the market failure. For example, a lot of investment doesn't go really to the global goods, to climate change, to biodiversity, to the social infrastructure. So how can we then redirect that with a public and private finance? For that, of course, we need to reform the fiscal system, right? We need to integrate the environmental and social cost in the investment. We need to have harmonized language, because what does it mean sustainability for a bank? They need to understand what is that, right? So in that is where we are talking about how can we support harmonized taxonomies that, if you want, is like the dictionary that the banks or the investment use to really understand what is sustainable infrastructure, what are the risks for climate. So when the banks have a common language, then they can, and they understand that, they can redirect their investment, right? And then we also want to have a better disclosure, transparency, and share of data. The banks need to also disclose where are they investing, and we need to share data also on what are the risks. So this is something that we are doing here in UNEP. I don't know if you are familiar. We have the UN Finance Initiative that is working with the banks. We are working with more than 530 banks and investment institutions, and they account by $125 trillion. So if these banks redirect their investment, we can have a big change. So in that, we are working with them in capacity building, understanding on what is the responsible banking principles, on how to invest, and we have the Net Zero Banking Alliance. So the banks are starting to see how can I invest in projects, in infrastructure, in investment that will be net zero? How can I include the risk or the benefits of climate nature in my investment? So that's the first thing we are doing. Second slide. Now, governments are very important as well. They have their own public budget, right? So we also need to help governments to say, how can you use more effectively your limited public budget? And in that, we have different tools. First of all is to say, okay, how can you, government, can embed resilience? And when I say resilience, it's financial resilience, but also climate and environmental resilience in your investment. How, as Natalia was saying, how can we help them to reduce all these subsidies that you were saying that are going to fossil fuels or pesticides? Hey, can we redirect the public subsidies that you are giving to harmful products and redirect them to sustainable investment? So in this, UNEP is working with governments in sustainable budgeting approach. So we advise and we are developing tools for governments that they can find where is the best way to put the public funding budget to invest in sustainable infrastructure, renewable energy, in environmental biodiversity protection, and also how to minimize the harmful fiscal subsidies. Sustainable public procurement is also another key tool that we are working. And when I see sustainable public procurement, when I say that, it's very important because you need to consider, and I wanted to share this, the government is the biggest consumer. They account globally by 13 to 20% of the global GDP. So that means they are managing globally, the public procurement is around $9.5 trillion. So imagine if we can help governments and say, governments, you need to purchase, you need to invest on sustainable products, on sustainable infrastructure, because the government is the main provider for health, education, infrastructure. So can they redirect and use that public procurement into sustainable things? And then they can help to shift the market as well and generate innovation. So that's another important area that we are working. Third one, next slide, and thank you. So risks. How can we inform the financial institutions also in integrating environmental risk in the investment? And let me translate that a little to you. So imagine you as a bank want to invest in a project, beautiful infrastructure, housing. Hey, but then you are not aware that that is an area that is very vulnerable to climate or natural disaster. Is in a bank of a river, maybe 3 years is going to be a flooding. And that investment that you did in 2 years, gone. Why? Because you didn't look at the climate risk. Or if you are investing in a project, but you are not aware that actually that project is going to create massive deforestation or is going to put in danger wildlife. So that's why we are helping the banks with the UNEP 5 Risk Center in informing them on what are those environmental risks that they need to consider in the investment, in the lending, in the projects that they are doing. And that can create more innovation, and again, is redirecting the investment to areas where there are no risks for climate, and that can be better for sustainability. Next slide, please. And then we all know, basically, if we look closely at our economy and on this situation, we always say, and for you that know the UNEP medium-term strategy, our narrative, we say that the root cause of all these environmental and triple planetary crisis is really based on the unsustainable patterns of consumption and production, and based on a linear economy of extraction, production, and waste. So we really need to reshape that and really move towards sustainable consumption and production. Yes, you might be very active in changing education and awareness raising in our own consumption patterns, but for us to change, we also have to have the right market signals, right? If a sustainable product is 3 times more expensive, maybe we can afford it, or we don't have access to that. So how can we work with the market signals to make the sustainable products affordable? Second, how can we help governments to invest also in public infrastructure? Think about public transport. Instead of promoting private cars, can we promote public transport? Can we give sustainable housing with high-tech or renewable energy, smart buildings? So that we can help consumers and citizens to move more towards sustainable consumption and production. And then support the private sector to create more innovation and sustainable competitiveness. So, and the last one, of course, cannot be missing. We need to look now, of course, on the digital transformation. All this technology, artificial intelligence, all this is transforming. But then here, what we are proposing is we need to invest in capacities. How can we going to reduce the digital divide? How are we going to also strengthen and direct finance also for developing countries to have access to these technologies, and then empower the local enterprises? So with that, I will stop, and I just want to invite you all to participate creativity from your own space in helping and rethinking how can we reshape this financial system globally. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this, Adriana. This was fascinating and great to learn more about UNEP's work in this space. And we will definitely have some more questions for you during the panel and from the audience later in the Q&A. But in the meantime, I would like to hand over to Julian and Christine for your presentation. Please go ahead.
Great, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Julian Verkhuis, and I'm part of the Beyond Lab. I'll let Kristin introduce herself.
Hello, everyone. Also, warm welcome from my side. My name is Christine Fassen, and I'm also from the Beyond Lab, and I'm very excited to get this started today.
I'll just share my screen. Hopefully you can see it again. So yes, thank you very much first for inviting us to speak at the Youth Environment Assembly, and apologies we cannot be with you in Nairobi. I'm myself in New York. Kristin is in Geneva, so we're struggling with a cold. But I'm glad that we have this opportunity at least to share this initiative of the youth moving beyond GDP. So we are working on this initiative with our partners, Rethinking Economics International and the UN Trade and Development Agency, and is supported by the German government. So before we dive into what is the initiative, which Kristin will do, I'll just provide an overview of the Beyond Lab, the origins, or what does GDP actually mean and what's wrong with it, and then the birth of the Beyond GDP process within the United Nations. So this slide is quite crowded, so I don't expect everyone to read, but essentially the Beyond Lab is part of the Director General's office in UN Geneva. And essentially we are a multi-stakeholder space where we invite different stakeholders from private sector, from academia, from civil society to really think what does long-term sustainability mean and what would it embody. So it's thinking really beyond 2030. What is kind of society that we want? So it includes the Beyond GDP work, but also how to use emotions. So we have the hope method where we use hope as an emotion, as a catalyst for change. And we have future balance where we use AI, for example, to look at the pros and cons of different policies across different dimensions from environment, economy, social. So we look in some ways at what is beyond 2030. Now on to GDP. So it was mentioned in Adriana's speech. Again, GDP is in our language pretty much every day. We hear it in the news, we hear it even sometimes in private conversations. So it stands for gross domestic product, which essentially is the market value, which is the price of all final goods and services produced and rendered in a specific time period in a country. So there is different formulas to calculate it, but normally the basic one is consumption plus government spending plus exports minus imports plus private investment. So essentially it was developed in the 17th century to calculate taxes and was further refined during the Great Depression to understand really how bad it was. So in the 1930s by Simon Kuznets. But quickly, essentially, he raised the concern that this is a very good measure to understand how the economy is producing, but it's a very poor indicator of the welfare of a nation. However, because it was so versatile and easy to use, in some ways it was widely adopted, especially after the Second World War with the Bretton Woods Agreement. And it essentially became the main tool for policymaking. And the UN supported this through the system of national accounts. So through the UN system, statisticians agreed on how to measure GDP in a harmonized way. However, quickly, especially in the 70s, it was identified that the limitation of GDP, so it doesn't include health. You don't know, for example, how well you're doing even mental health. In terms of social equity, environmental costs, they're not considered. There was a famous publication from the Club of Rome on the limits of growth, where in a society with limited resources, we cannot expect to constantly be growing. Then the concept of sustainable development came to the forefront with the Brundtland Report in the 1987. And further criticism essentially arose with GDP. However, its position was not really rocked and kept essentially central stage. Then the Sustainable Development Goals came to the front with the 2030 Agenda in 2015 and introduced this kind of the universal measurement framework for sustainable development, which includes the famous 17 goals. And within actually goal 17, there's an actual specific target to develop new indicators alongside GDP. So there's already kind of an attempt to encourage the broader audience to really think of, well, how can we measure development that is not based on GDP? Since 2015, we have seen several global crises. We had several climate disasters, inequality kept rising, the pandemic with COVID-19. And it shows that essentially our lived experience is just so far removed from GDP, because GDP has kept growing, whilst our, like, for example, as you mentioned, extreme poverty is increasing. Grounded essentially, but what was very useful in the 2030 agenda is that it grounded the principle of intergenerational equity, which is something that, for example, in the Beyond Lab is what it's in our DNA, is what drives us. Fast forward to 2021, the UN Secretary General published our Common Agenda report and called to correct a glaring blind spot in GDP. So it really kind of framed the discussion of beyond GDP as not just a technical indicator discussion, but really as a transformative global governance agenda. So it's really to rethink of how we invest, on how we make decisions. And this called for a summit of the future. The summit of the future was essentially bringing all member states to discuss and agree what they wanted to commit for future generations. So it concretized into the Pact for the Future, which had several actions, but one of them was essentially creating a mandate to the Secretary General on beyond GDP. So it had two tasks. The first one was to establish a high-level expert group to recommend universal indicators beyond GDP. This was the first time that the General Assembly mandated the UN to essentially create a framework that went beyond GDP. Second task was to launch a UN-led intergovernmental process after the experts group work in consultation with stakeholders. So essentially it's now to operationalize or implement the recommendations of the high-level expert group. This is the high-level expert group. There is 14 experts from around the world that have been working on alternative beyond GDP metrics. And it essentially aims to identify a maximum of 20 indicators. So they're still discussing if it's going to be one index where they kind of congregate or aggregate all the data, or a dashboard where essentially give visibility of different indicators. And the aim essentially is to capture what we value. So capture sustainable development dimensions that are beyond GDP. So it's important to highlight that they're not planning to discard GDP, but they plan to complement it. And the aim is essentially to help decision makers make better decisions. So to give them better visibility on how are the health outcomes, the education outcomes, or the environmental stock or capacity that a country has. But it also aims to shift societal views of progress. So at the moment, as a result of this, the GDP center stage, and the narrative was around GDP. So how can you create a new narrative that is not based just on gross domestic product and the growth of it? And then is also to strengthen statistical capacity, because whatever new target that you adopt, countries would have to have capacity to be able to gather that data and measure it. So there's a lot of work on kind of building on the SDGs indicators, building on other initiatives to make sure that there's not an additional burden, especially for low-income countries, to be able to carry out that statistical assessment. Now I'll pass, and then what has been a key achievement with the lab, which Kristen is going to mention, is that we were with the high-level expert group in Doha at the World Summit for Social Development, where they presented their interim recommendations. So they have 3 pillars that are cross-cutting. So you have well-being, equity and inclusion, and sustainability. But then you also have these more concrete concrete in the process still of 7 domains, which are areas essentially that they believe are important and should be measured. So these are material well-being. So it includes income, It includes also opportunity, job quality, economic security, so access to housing, internet, safety nets. It includes health, so maternal or childhood health, life expectancy, chronic disease rates, education, so access to preschool, high school, higher education, but also having actual skills and knowledge to be able to participate in the labor market and in social life. Environmental quality, so clean air, water, absence of pollutants, lots of biodiversity. Subjective well-being, this is quite a broad domain. So it includes physical health, mental health, hope, agency, perception of safety, trust, and governance, life satisfaction. Then there's social capital, which is essentially our community. So their sense of belonging, ability to participate, friends or family to rely on. Governance, finally, which is around the safety and security, ability to participate in societal decisions and activities, and absence of discrimination. As you can see, these are quite broad and they're not in the indicator shape. They're more like areas at the moment. And the expert group is still in this consultation phase and is welcome to receive other contributions. But now their work would be essentially to further define these domains and turn them into indicator. So this is where I will stop from the kind of context of the Beyond GDP within the UN, and I'll pass it to Kristin to present more about the Youth Moving Beyond GDP initiative. Kristin, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Julian, for also laying out all the groundwork on Beyond GDP. I always find it super helpful to also remind myself of why we have GDP and all of these things. But I would like to now come in to say where the place for the youth is in this. I hope you can also tell that the team is quite young at the Beyond Lab. So hopefully we are actually executing what we're preaching. And with that, let's get into the idea of what is the Youth Moving Beyond GDP initiative. So next slide, please, Julian. So, what is the basic objective of this initiative? It is basically to create a network of young experts and young economic thinkers to foster a very inclusive space for transformative engagement. So, to have a place where we can actually promote the ideas and interests of the youth and of future generations who don't have a seat at the table just yet because they aren't born, but they still need to be considered. And our focus for this is basically how to progress on the Sustainable Development Agenda, specifically by complementing the GDP for the reasons that Julian gave earlier. So let's continue to the next. So what is the idea? Like, how are we doing this? The objective of all of this is to basically break the intergenerational glass ceiling. So to actually engage young people in this process and integrate intergenerational and also international perspectives to make sure there's a lot of regions and hopefully all regions in the world that are reflected in this process. And we have developed youth-led recommendations through a very grassroots inclusive process. But I'll get to this in a bit, so we can move to the next slide for now. So how this all got started was with an essay competition that was earlier this year. And we basically asked what counts and what is relevant for you in the future. So what do we need to value to reflect what we actually want to value? And we received over 600 essays from over 50 countries. And the winners of this essay competition were flown into Geneva and had very high-level meetings, including the Director General of UN Geneva, other member states and academia, to present their ideas and to actually be heard out and listened to. And with that, let's go to the next one. And based on this, we launched this Youth Moving Beyond GDP network at FFD4 in Sevilla earlier this year. And ever since then, we've started to have intergenerational discussions and consultations. And in September, we launched the first official consultation process to get intergenerational input into policymaking. And we can move on to the next slide because I can get a bit on the process of this. So ever since that very first meeting in September, over 1,000 members joined, and it's still open to join for anyone who's interested from over 90 countries. So a very diverse group of people, but still not diverse enough. So we always welcome people from different backgrounds to join as well. And over these past 3 months, we've developed in a very co-creative process these policy recommendations. So we had a very initial set survey where we asked about best practices, values, ideas for policy recommendations. And based on this, we kind of found the common themes of what the youth actually care about and what we need to advocate for. And this was then followed up with a validation survey where you could add and also remove things that are not as important to the youth. And then we had some consultative calls where the youth network actually just got into the nitty-gritty details and discussed amongst each other to really define what is what actually matters to us and what do we want to, as a network, stand for. And throughout this process, we always made sure to have youth representatives at the very key moments in the Beyond GDP agenda at the UN, such as the Human Rights Economy Roundtable convened by OHCHR in October, or at a joint side event with UNCTAD at UNCTAD 16. So it's very great that we always were able to have youth representatives there with ambassadors, with global experts, with UN personnel, and to really discuss what the youth want to bring into this conversation. So next slide, please. And this is kind of the big culmination of what we were building up to. Because as Julian alluded to earlier, this was all in preparation for the Second World Social Summit in Doha, which was happening earlier this November. And as the Beyond Lab, we co-hosted a session with the high-level expert group. And it was the first public presentation of the expert group's interim recommendations. But it wasn't only that, because at the very same time, and very much on an eye level, we presented, or our youth network representative, Palak Khanna, presented our network recommendations. And as you can maybe and hopefully see in the picture, the Deputy Secretary General of the UN, Amina Mohammed, was there and stayed throughout the whole entire session and was personally hand-delivered these youth recommendations. And for us, it's just amazing to see what the reception is on this high UN level, because also the expert group really treated the youth network as an expert and as an idea giver and not just as a token to be considered. But I also want to very briefly get into the content of these recommendations, because we did try to model the interim report of the high-level expert group a bit, but we're bringing in our own perspectives of what matters to us and what matters to the youth. So we developed, and I won't go into too much detail because you can also, if you're interested, download these on our website. But we have 3 guiding principles that are very cross-cutting and that should apply to all the different indicators. The first one being human rights based. So these indicators must uphold dignity for everyone. The second one is intergenerational justice. So every indicator should make sure that progress on this indicator promises a better future for future generations and does not harm their ability to live. The third one is a country-owned but yet globally relevant indicator. So this means that these indicators need to be relevant for the entire world, but they also need to reflect the lived realities of each and every context of each country, because just imposing one set of one-size-fits-all solutions will not be equally receptive or received in different countries. And similar to the high-level expert group, we have different domains, and I'll just very quickly read them out, which is participatory and fair governance, equity, inclusion, and knowledge justice, resilient well-being, planetary boundaries, and environmental justice, and lastly, spillover accountabilities. And this is really meant to reflect what the majority of the youth demands. So as you heard from Julian, this process is still ongoing and the high-level expert group is receiving inputs. So for all of you who are interested, and obviously this is also with an environmental focus, do feel free to put in your ideas to make sure that the youth actually shape the next future sustainable agenda and that it's not just imposed by the experts today. And with that, I'm very happy to conclude our presentation on this and welcome the next part of this event today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julian and Christian, for your fascinating presentation. It's really, really exciting to understand more about what the Beyond Lab is doing, and also very encouraging to see the extent to which you're engaging youth in your work and processes. Let's now, as we're a little bit short of time, move into a very quick panel, and then hopefully we can still have some time for questions from the audience at the end. So moving into the panel discussion, Given, I would like to turn to you first, because we have heard about some exciting initiatives, and there's clearly a momentum within the UN system towards transforming finance and economics, which I think is encouraging for all of us to see. But I'd love to hear from your perspective, what are the key shifts that young people are pushing for when it comes to redesigning the economic and financial systems? What are the big priorities or values that you still feel need to be centered in these transformations? Over to you.
Thanks for that, Natalia. And of course, thank you to the presenters. I think at a very high level, priorities of young people when it comes to intergenerational equity and financing the future are along three axes. The first is recognizing the value or the worth of assets. The second is funding what needs funding. And the third is to make the right choice, the profitable choice. Now, at a high level, this sounds, I guess, fairly vague, but to go into in a bit more detail, when it comes to the value of assets, I think that sort of speaks to the point that Julian raised about different kinds of capitals that we have in the world: physical capital, human capital, natural capital, and social capital. And as it stands, the way we measure economic activity is really a flow-based measurement. We are looking at how quickly we burn out the current capital base that we have and what that means in terms of extracting the value and turning it into the flow of money for the exits that extract the value from these systems. So what has to happen here is that we have to find a way to prevent, current stakeholders and generations from claiming economic success whilst leaving future generations with a huge deficit and basically insolvent. The second thing, funding what needs funding, I think this is one of the biggest rallying cries that you hear at COPs, the polluter pays or loss and damage funding or funding for adaptation. And I think here it's fundamentally a mismatch between liabilities and assets that we have, right? So there is a huge amount of global savings in the world that exist when it comes to our public institutions, our pension funds, our banks, our central banks. But global needs and investment are not being met as they are. And so we have to really think about a way to shift around these risks and to rethink them and make sure that the funding that exists out there, the assets that exist, are flowing where it's most needed. And to do that, we have to really structurally transform the incentives, the measurements that we use to get there. And very connected to this is the third ask, which is that of returns the incentives, and that is making the right choice, the profitable choice. As it stands, a country in the Middle East pumping oil spends about $2 per barrel of oil, and that barrel of oil can be sold for about $60. And so when you're making a profit of about, I don't know, like 30 times, it's very hard to wean yourself off of that. And in some senses, it's an entirely rational decision to take that course of action. But when we think about the fact that many countries in the world who are not oil producers are subsidizing the system to the great destruction of our economic systems and public health, then it becomes quite hard to think about. The World Bank, the IMF, a few years ago in a landmark study noted that the global system is subsidizing fossil fuels to the tune of about $1.5 trillion per year in direct subsidies. So this is money that the Kenyan government spends to make petrol, gasoline cheaper for purchase for people at the pump. And in addition to that, there is a further $5.5 trillion of indirect subsidies. So these indirect subsidies are a reflection of the erosion of the asset base, the capital base that I talked about previously. Then this is the loss of the value when it comes to having dirtier air, more pollution, undrinkable water systems, for example. So I'll stop there for now and the floor back to you.
Thanks so much for just giving and for sharing that your perspective on this topic. Julian and Christian, I would like to move to you next with a quick question because you shared this high-level vision for beyond GDP, which I think is really, really fascinating. But I'm curious, based on your extensive engagement with stakeholders so far, including youth, I'm wondering if you are seeing already any initiatives take off on the ground in this space, and if you could share with us any interesting case studies, perhaps even youth-led, where you're seeing this actually being implemented in practice on the ground. Over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, so there is definitely a lot of examples that were shared with us when we did the consultations from the Wales Futures Act, for example, which mandated essentially every policy to have this youth analysis to understand the impact they will have on future generations. However, one thing that we also started to see, there was much often a lot of the examples came from the global north, so New Zealand, Wales, and other countries like Belgium, for example. But now more and more examples are actually coming from developing countries. So you have, for example, Zambia, you have Brazil that are, for example, Brazil is adopting or is considering adopting a gross national happiness index, similar to Bhutan. And these examples essentially are showing that there is a slow shift, that realization that essentially GDP is not right. Even in institutions that have driven essentially the GDP paradigm, like the IMF, there is the development of this resilience sustainability trust, where, for example, it helps specifically low-income and vulnerable middle-income countries to build resilience against external shocks, where they understand that if you just drive GDP, you're also driving potential vulnerability, where you have to consider essentially external shocks to like climate pandemics to essentially make sure that an economy is stable. So there is a shift definitely happening, and youth have been driving this in some ways. When we had discussions with the youth network, there was a broader kind of understanding that the current paradigm is not right, and that we should even be more ambitious, not just be beyond GDP, but essentially be beyond growth, which is quite distinct. And yeah, so I think there is definitely kind of a broader wave that is coming, and hopefully this would just magnify further and further to be able to make that case that GDP should be something complementary to something else rather than just the sole measure. I'll give it to Kristen. I'm not sure if she would like to add anything else.
I think with an eye on time, I'm happy to give it back to the floor.
Okay, thank you so much for that answer. It's really fascinating because actually, for the context of those who are just joining us for this session, we're having a bit of a day today where we discuss many of the structural transformations. So we talked about the landscape of the multilateral environmental agreements earlier, and of course, we're talking about financial and economic transformation right now. So I personally find it really fascinating to hear about how those transformations might be starting on the ground and how that then can take off within those high-level spaces such as the United Nations, which can help advance some of those initiatives. So really, thank you so much for sharing those examples. And I would now like to turn back to you, Adriana, because you shared also some really exciting examples of UNEP's work in this space. I wonder how you see the role of UNEP evolving in this context, especially given some of the political headwinds that have been faced by the alliances, such as the Net Zero Banking Alliance, insurance, asset managers, etc. I wonder how you see the role of UNEP evolving, and especially given some of the ideas that we heard shared by our other panelists, how you see topics such as beyond GDP, intergenerational equity, but also filling those financing gaps in particular for the most vulnerable, such as adaptation, but also in those areas which are deemed higher risk today under the current financial frameworks, how you see that evolving in the direction of the future direction of UNEP's work. Over to you.
Thanks, Natalia, for this question. So this is still a key priority for UNEP, so we will continue. And for those who have seen our draft medium-term strategy, you will see that in the finance and economic transformation, we have actually 4 priority areas. The first one is accelerating the shift and the transformation to sustainable consumption and production and circular economy. For that, we need to continue and strengthen the work with the private sector. The public, so public finance is the third one, and you will be very happy, and Julian and Christine also, our 4th key priority is to look also at the new metrics, and of course this is linked to the work that we are doing, and we are cooperating with you in metrics to go beyond GDP, and that can inform investment. So, going then to your other question, yes, of course, we are aware, and I think we all see now the geopolitical situation, the governments who are now moving toward deregulation when what we want is to create more harmonized frameworks in the banking. What we believe is that there is still a firm commitment from most of hopefully our partners in the finance, so we don't see that this will be a huge change. But what we are doing differently, Natalia, is we are now looking more, UNEP Finance, Sustainable Finance Initiative is now looking deeper and deeper on what we call the high impact sectors. So really looking, and I like what you all say, no? Funding what needs funding. Funding what is needed, no? So if we look in high impact sectors such as infrastructure, food, mobility, textile, plastics, critical minerals, if we really invest sustainability there, we will have a big shift and more gain. So how can we redirect that and we focus more on that in the public and private? So you will see, and that's what we are seeing more. I'm happy to see that the last years, the work of UNEP, for example, is moving more to pollution. They were very active in the INC negotiation, and to our surprise, there was a lot of commitment from the financial sector in the beat plastic pollution. And they are now also investing in nature positive. So I think, we see now that when the banks and the finance sector understands the benefit, that this is not, charity, or that there are important gains to have, and also reducing risk is good. So yeah, I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for sharing that. And it's great to hear that there is definitely that continued commitment to move into that direction and potentially look at some of those questions also raised by our other panelists. With that, I think maybe we can take another few minutes because we're at time, but I would really like to give the audience an opportunity to ask their questions. So let's try to wrap up in the next few minutes. But if there are any questions in the audience, I would like to ask those. Okay. Samuel, I saw your hand first, so please go for it.
Just a brief questions. Thank you, Adriana. Finally meeting you in person here. I'm glad. Just want to ask you regarding revitalizing multilateralism for this agenda. We all know that countries sometimes they want a clear modality on how this kind of new emerging agendas are being implemented. For example, I reckon my government is always exploring how it could be beneficial, how it could tackle trade-off, etc., etc. But I just want to ask, do you think that this agenda on Beyond GDP, according to you from UNEP, can bring a greater ownership of all agencies across the UN system? Or do you think there will still be challenges that we need to work on in tackling silos? That's it. Thank you.
Maybe we can take one or two more questions and then we will hand it over back to panelists to answer.
Thank you for the opportunity. I'm Hadija Jilo from Swahili Port Hub Foundation, and I have two questions about the finance. Question one is that what are some of the ways that you use to ensure that the finances or investments gets to the right people or the right projects? And number two, what are the tools that you use to measure the impacts of the said projects? Thank you.
Okay, perhaps one more question. Gentleman there in the second row.
Okay, thank you. My name is Dennis Katingi from the Economic Students Association of Kenya. So given that the third Youth Environment Assembly focuses on youth engagement for a sustainable future, what innovative financial mechanisms can support young people in implementing innovative climate and environmental projects, given that funding still remains one of the barriers when it comes to young people coming up with innovative solutions? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me hand it back over to our panelists to answer those questions. Ariana, would you like to start?
Yes, thank you so much for these questions. Answering the first one, I think Juliana and Christine will agree with me. We are working as a UN system on these efforts on going beyond GDP. So this is something that is embraced by the UN Secretary General and Under Secretary General. So is all, and I think in this dialogue, Julia and Christine, you agree, there's a wide dialogue with many different UN agencies, UNEP, UNDP, many more are engaged in this. I do believe this is very important, and as UNEP, that's what we are saying. If we continue just measuring how rich you are in terms of GDP, we are not looking at the full picture. So in previous work in UNEP, we were looking at natural capital. How rich is a country in terms of biodiversity, nature? So that is very important to count in and to consider in the richness. So I believe that all this work on joint GDP and the efforts on having that open, including the engagement of youth, is to avoid that this will be like a silo effort, and that hopefully we can have a global consensus and start looking at the richness of a country in a different way. So that first, I will give the floor to other questions, but just on the second question, social inclusion, how do we measure that? It's very important that when we are looking at projects, let me talk, for example, on sustainable public procurement or sustainable consumption production, is in the government, when we work with procurement, is to see how, if the government start putting sustainability criteria in the purchasing, are they going to consider small and medium enterprises? Can they invite, for example, local communities in the bidding process, like they can be also a supplier? We have beautiful examples in some countries that, for example, the government is purchasing organic food from the local communities or the traditional clothing. So they look at ways so that they can also have a social inclusion. Another important one is we need to avoid really, like when we talk about sustainable consumption, we are looking at a green elite. So what we are emphasizing more is how do we make sure that the sustainable solutions products are affordable and accessible to also low-income communities and people, right? Think about public transport. When it's more expensive, then people cannot participate. So you need to make it affordable. Or and then also UNEP has been working with the UN human rights, and they have done guidelines also to include that. And yeah, so they are saying we are working, and I think Natalia and Gubin are good witness on how UNEP is working with the youth. For us, it's very important to open the space for the dialogue. One important project we had was the Green Jobs for Youth Pact, and in that we have a committee with engagement. So I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adriana. Kristen and Julian, to you online, I wonder if you would like to touch on some of the questions or if you have any further thoughts before we wrap up.
Yes, thank you, Natalia. I think Adriana gave a brilliant response to the siloed approach within the UN, at least on this beyond GDP topic, and how we're trying to really break the silos of creating a community of practice. But I also want to briefly touch on Dennis's question about financial innovation to break down barriers. And I think because this is also a youth assembly, we need to make sure that we embed intergenerational justice in governance itself to actually make sure that these are issues that are heard and that are dealt with. So an example could be that youth and future generations need to have seats in global financial or finance reform bodies and multilateral development banks. To actually bring up these issues and be on the table where it gets decided that we can raise these areas and these barriers. So it's important also in this to reflect that youth are not monolithic, they're not all equal. They need to be represented in its full diversity and not just have a token youth representative there, but have more of an advisory body that is made up of different people, of different backgrounds, different ages and diversities. So this is really that we move beyond tokenism, because I do think that this is the solution to also address these youth issues, as you said, Dennis, is the financing for these innovative solutions. Yeah, so I think to me, embedding intergenerational justice is the innovation in itself.
Thank you so much for those comments. Lastly, Cuban, would you like to add anything as well?
Sure. I think just one quick remark on each of the latter two questions. The first on how to make sure finance is going to the right things and how to measure it. One thing I'll note is that the reason why the integrated system perspective is so important is because it is very, very rare that the money spent on a project is the money that is, owned by the person developing the project. There are multiple intermediaries in the system, your asset owners, asset managers, banks, lenders, and you have to give each of these people the incentives to spend the money in what we call the right way, whether it's towards mitigation or adaptation projects. And I think that's one respect in which why the FI model of engaging stakeholders across the entire financial ecosystem is so important. The second about innovative financial mechanisms for youth-led innovation. I think we have 95% of the innovations and technology we need to address climate mitigation. And in the last 5%, I think it's entirely about funding science and research and education. And even in the very first 95%, I think education goes such a long way. And this is an area where financialization or innovation is not so much needed as a steady, consistent core funding to education systems through your kindergartens through to tertiary education. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Given, for your thoughts on this as well. We're past time, so this is the moment to wrap up this session. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you to our amazing guests and panelists. I just want to leave you with one last thought. I will avoid long closing remarks, given that we don't have more time. But as you approach the OECPR and YEA in the coming weeks, and you look at the resolutions on the agenda and you review them critically, please make sure to consider to what extent they actually help advance those systemic transformations that we have discussed this morning in the early afternoon, whether that's for finance, but also on other topics such as multilateral environmental agreements that we spoke about earlier. Because as mentioned earlier as well, as we're approaching 2030 and also many environmental goals, but also many tipping points and planetary boundaries, all resolutions that are on the agenda at this YEA, they should have systemic impact. And if they do not, let's take this opportunity over the next 2 weeks to make sure that we demand that of policymakers. Thank you so much.